Between December 1989 and November 1990, 7 men were shot and killed along the highways of Florida. Each had been traveling alone. Each had picked up a female hitchhiker. Each was found shot at close range with a .22 caliber pistol, their belongings missing, their bodies abandoned near wooded areas off the interstate. The killer was methodical and mobile. Investigators had almost nothing to work with, until they found 2 items pawned in a Daytona Beach shop and traced them to a woman named Aileen Carol Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was born in Rochester, Michigan in February 1956. Her early life was shaped by abandonment, abuse, and an almost complete absence of protection. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in prison when Aileen was 13. Her mother abandoned her as an infant. She was raised by grandparents who were, by multiple accounts, violent and alcoholic. She was pregnant by 15, the result of rape, she said, and gave the baby up for adoption. She was homeless by 16, surviving by prostitution along the Michigan highways. By the time she arrived in Florida in her late 20s, she had lived a life that would read as fiction if it were not documented in arrest records, social services files, and court transcripts. She met Tyria Moore in a Daytona biker bar in 1986. The two formed a relationship that would last until the murders began. Wuornos supported them both through prostitution, working the rest stops and truck stops of Florida's interstate system. She later said the men she killed had either raped her or threatened to. She claimed self-defense for each killing. Prosecutors argued she had killed for money and to eliminate witnesses. The victims were Richard Mallory, a television repairman, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, whose body was never found, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio. Mallory, investigators later discovered, had been convicted of rape in Maryland in 1958, a fact that was not disclosed at Wuornos's trial due to a legal ruling, and that she later cited as central to her claim of self-defense. Tyria Moore, granted immunity in exchange for cooperation, recorded phone calls with Wuornos at the direction of investigators. Wuornos, believing she was talking to the woman she loved, confessed. She was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. She waived her final appeals in 2002, saying she wanted to be executed and that she had no reason to continue. On October 9th, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mother ship and all. I'll be back." Whether Aileen Wuornos was a predator, a survivor, pushed past a breaking point, or something the justice system had never properly defined, was a question her trial never fully answered. It remains one that courts, academics, and filmmakers are still arguing today. In April 1908, the farmhouse of Belle Gunness burned to the ground on the outskirts of La Porte, Indiana. In the ruins, investigators found 4 bodies, 3 children and a headless woman assumed to be Belle herself. It seemed a tragedy. Then they began digging. What they found in the grounds of that farm would make Belle Gunness one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and leave open a question that has never been definitively answered. Did she die in that fire, or did she start it? Belle was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storset in Norway in 1859. She emigrated to America in 1881, settling eventually in Chicago and then Indiana. She was a large, physically powerful woman, reportedly over 200 pounds, and strong enough to do the work of a farmhand. She married twice, and both husbands died. Both had life insurance. Both deaths were ruled natural or accidental. By the early 1900s, Bell had established a pattern. She would place advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, seeking suitors, men of means, men with farms, men willing to relocate. The advertisements emphasized her prosperity and her need for a partner. Men came. They were met with warmth and good cooking. And then they disappeared. After the fire, Ray Lamphere, a farmhand who had worked for Bell and reportedly been dismissed after becoming too attached to her, was arrested for arson and murder. He was convicted of arson, but acquitted of murder. In prison, he reportedly told a minister that Bell had indeed killed multiple men on the farm, chloroforming them, and then butchering them before burying the bodies in the grounds. He also said she had faked her death and escaped. Investigators excavated the farm and found the remains of at least 12 victims, some estimates run to 40 or more, dismembered and buried in pits, some wrapped in gunny sacks. Identified victims included Old Bootsburg of Wisconsin, who had withdrawn his life savings before traveling to La Porte, John Moe of Minnesota, Andrew Helgeline of South Dakota, whose disappearance had prompted his brother to write to Bell. A letter that may have triggered the fire. The headless body found in the ruins was never confirmed to be Bell's. The head was never found. She was smaller than Bell's known physique. A woman matching Bell's description was reportedly seen boarding a train out of La Porte the morning before the fire. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson died in California while awaiting trial for poisoning a man for his money. Photographs of Carlson bore a striking resemblance to Belle Gunness. Investigators examined the lead, but produced no definitive identification. Belle Gunness killed at least 12 people, possibly many more, over a period of years on a quiet Indiana farm. Whether she died in the fire she may have set herself, or whether she slipped away into the American interior and lived out her days under a new name, has never been proven. What is known is that the farm in La Porte gave up its dead slowly, one body at a time, from the earth of a place where men had come looking for love and found only a grave. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair attended by over 27 million people in the span of 6 months. It was a spectacle of ambition and innovation, the greatest public event America had ever staged. And, less than a mile from the fairgrounds, a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who called himself Henry Howard Holmes, or H. H. Holmes, had built a hotel specifically designed for murder. Holmes was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, in 1861. He was a charmer, handsome, eloquent, and possessed of an extraordinary ability to convince people to trust him. He attended the University of Michigan Medical School, where he developed a fascination with human anatomy and began his first known frauds, taking out life insurance policies on cadavers from the medical school and claiming they were accidental death victims. He was never caught. He moved to Chicago. In the late 1880s, Holmes took over a pharmacy on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street, in the Englewood neighborhood near the fairgrounds. He subsequently purchased the vacant lot across the street and began building. The building he constructed was 3 stories tall, mixed commercial and residential use, and contained 100 rooms. Contemporaries later called it the Castle. What made it unlike any other building in Chicago was what Holmes had built into its walls. The upper floors contained rooms that could be sealed airtight. Gas pipes ran through the walls, connected to valves that Holmes controlled from his own room. There were trap doors, false floors, chutes that led directly to the basement. The basement contained a dissection table, a kiln large enough to cremate a human body, acid vats, and a collection of surgical instruments. Holmes had designed the building himself and had employed multiple contractors in rotating shifts so that no single worker ever saw enough of the plans to understand what he was constructing. During the exposition, Holmes rented rooms to visitors, particularly young women who had come to Chicago alone to work or attend the fair. Many of them were never seen again. Holmes took out insurance policies on some of them. Others he killed and dissected, selling the skeletons to medical schools, which accepted them without question. Holmes was finally caught in 1894 after a series of insurance frauds led investigators to Philadelphia. In custody, he confessed to 27 murders, though later recanted some confessions and added others. The true number of his victims is unknown. Estimates range from 20 to 200. He was hanged in Philadelphia on May 7th, 1896. He requested that his coffin be filled with cement so that his body could not be exhumed and studied. The same request his medical school victims might have made. It was granted. His descendants, in recent years, successfully petitioned for his grave to be opened and DNA tested to confirm his identity, amid persistent rumors that he had faked his own death. The test confirmed it was Holmes, or at least that it was the man who said he was Holmes. In a life built entirely on false identities, even that certainty feels fragile. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 people in Wisconsin and Ohio. The crimes he committed went beyond killing. He dismembered his victims, preserved parts of their bodies, and in some cases consumed human flesh. These facts are known. They are documented. They are part of the court record and the confessions Dahmer gave to investigators after his arrest. What makes the Dahmer case remarkable, in the most disturbing sense, is not what he did. It is what was missed. The number of times law enforcement had contact with Dahmer and his crimes before anyone connected the pieces. The opportunities that existed to stop him years before he was caught, and how each one failed. Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978 when he was 18 years old. His parents had recently separated. He was alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, when he picked up a hitchhiker, took him home, killed him, dismembered him, and buried the remains in the backyard. He was not suspected. He was not investigated. He joined the army, served in Germany, was discharged after his alcohol abuse became unmanageable, and eventually settled in Milwaukee, where the killings resumed in 1987. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer killed 16 more people. Most of his victims were young black and Hispanic men he met at gay bars, bathhouses, and shopping malls. He would invite them back to his apartment, drug their drinks, kill them after they lost consciousness, and then engage in the behavior that defined the case's most disturbing aspects. He kept trophies, skulls, preserved body parts, photographs. The building where he lived generated complaints to the landlord about foul smells. Neighbors reported hearing sounds from his apartment. Several potential victims escaped. One, Conrack Cynthia Sumphone, a 14-year-old, escaped, confused and partly disoriented from the drugs, and was found on the street by two young women who called the police. Officers arrived, spoke to Dahmer, accepted his explanation that Cynthia Sumphone was his adult boyfriend who had drunk too much, and returned the boy to the apartment. Cynthia Sumphone was killed that night. The two women who had called the police tried repeatedly to tell the officers that something was wrong. They were dismissed. Those officers later said they had not checked whether Cynthia Sumphone was the age Dahmer claimed. They did not run a check on Dahmer, which would have revealed an earlier conviction for sexually assaulting a different minor, Cynthia Sumphone's own brother. The failure was documented, investigated, and the officers were eventually disciplined. Dahmer was arrested in July 1991 when another potential victim, Tracy Edwards, escaped from his apartment and flagged down a police car. Officers returned with Edwards to the apartment and discovered what was inside: photographs, preserved human remains, a skull in the refrigerator. Dahmer confessed immediately. Over the following weeks, he described each of his 17 killings in detail. At his trial, the defense argued not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury convicted him. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, the maximum available under Wisconsin law, which had no death penalty. Dahmer served 2 years in prison. In November 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, who killed Dahmer and another prisoner with a metal bar, while a prison work detail was unsupervised for 20 minutes. Scarver later said he acted because of his personal beliefs about Dahmer's crimes. The families of Dahmer's victims have spent decades navigating a grief compounded by knowledge of the missed opportunities. The neighbor who complained about smells, the women who called the police for Conrack Cynthia Sumphone, the earlier escape who reported what Dahmer had done to him, the earlier conviction, that was on record. At multiple points, the information existed that could have ended the killings. At multiple points, it was not acted on or not connected. 12 of Dahmer's 17 victims were black. Questions about whether the investigation's failures reflected racial bias in how potential victims were perceived, in whether their distress was taken seriously, have been raised repeatedly by families and civil rights advocates. They have never been fully resolved. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead. The 17 people he killed are also dead. Their names: Stephen Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Ricky Beeks, Eddie Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conrack Cynthia Sumphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft deserved to be spoken. They deserved much more than that. He never had to. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey came downstairs in her family's Boulder, Colorado home and found a 3-page ransom note on the kitchen stairs. The note demanded $118,000 for the return of her daughter, John Benet, who was missing from her room. Police were called. Friends arrived. Hours passed. And then, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, John Benet's father, John Ramsey, went to the basement of the house at police request to search for anything unusual. He found his daughter in a small room behind a latched door. She was wrapped in a white blanket. She had been strangled with a cord and struck on the head with enough force to cause a skull fracture. She had been 6 years old. What followed was one of the most intensely scrutinized, most widely discussed, and least resolved murder investigations in American history. 27 years later, nobody has been charged. Nobody has been convicted. The case remains officially open, and the question of who killed JonBenet Ramsey in her own home on Christmas night, 1996, remains unanswered. JonBenet was the younger daughter of John and Patsy Ramsey, a wealthy Boulder family. She had participated in child beauty pageants, and photographs and footage from those pageants became central to the media coverage of her murder. Images of a small girl in elaborate makeup and sequined costumes that generated controversy about child pageants, while simultaneously making her face the most recognizable missing child in America. The investigation was immediately complicated by decisions made in those first hours. Police allowed family members and friends to move through the house while it was a crime scene, potentially contaminating evidence. The note itself, 3 pages written in handwriting, later analyzed by experts, was left in the house for hours before being fully processed. The Boulder Police Department, unfamiliar with cases of this scale, made procedural errors that investigators later concluded had permanently damaged the evidentiary record. Suspicion fell on the family. It almost always does in cases where the victim is a child killed in the family home. John and Patsy Ramsey were subjected to years of investigation, public suspicion, and media scrutiny. They maintained their innocence consistently. The evidence against them was circumstantial and contested. No charges were ever filed. In 1999, a grand jury convened to examine the evidence, voted to indict both parents on charges related to child abuse resulting in death and being accessories to a crime. The district attorney declined to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence for conviction. The grand jury vote, initially sealed, was made public in 2013, 17 years after the murder. The case had other suspects. A man named Gary Oliva, who lived near the Ramseys and had a history of offenses against children, was later imprisoned on separate charges. A man named John Mark Carr, living in Thailand in 2006, confessed to the murder with specific details, and was extradited to Colorado before DNA testing excluded him entirely. His confession was false. His reasons for making it remain unclear. DNA collected from JonBenet's clothing has been the most persistent thread in the investigation. A male DNA profile was recovered from her underwear that does not match any member of the Ramsey family. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office used this DNA in 2008 to formally clear the Ramsey family of suspicion. Patsy Ramsey had died of cancer 2 years earlier. The DNA profile sits in a database. It has never matched anyone in that database. The technology has improved. The databases have grown. The profile remains unmatched. Who wrote the ransom note is another unsolved question. 3 pages handwritten, containing references to specific financial details of John Ramsey's business dealings that should not have been known to a random intruder. Hundreds of handwriting experts have examined it. The analysis has been contested. The note is still unattributed. JonBenet Ramsey would be 33 years old today. She has been dead for longer than she was alive. Her case has been the subject of books, documentaries, podcasts, news specials, and academic research. It has never produced a name. Somewhere, the person who wrote those 3 pages of careful handwriting on Christmas night killed a 6-year-old girl and left that note on the stairs to be found the next morning, has lived the decades since. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody knows if they are still alive. Nobody knows anything about them except the DNA in an underwear sample in an evidence locker in Colorado. The case is still open. In the summer of 1985, the people of Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area did something they had not done in living memory. They bought door locks by the thousands. They nailed their windows shut. They slept with weapons beside their beds. A man was entering homes at night, through unlocked windows, through sliding doors, through any gap he could find, and he was killing the people inside. He struck without pattern, without apparent target selection, across a geographic range that suggested either a car or a network. He left satanic symbols at some scenes. He demanded his surviving victims swear oaths to Satan before he fled. He was brazen enough to attack in populated neighborhoods, careful enough to leave almost nothing useful behind. Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, the youngest of 5 children of a Mexican railroad worker. His childhood was marked by trauma and an early fascination with violence, encouraged in part by a cousin who was a Vietnam veteran and who showed the young Ramirez photographs of atrocities committed overseas. That cousin later shot and killed his own wife in front of Ramirez. Ramirez moved to Los Angeles in the late 1970s. His first confirmed murder was in June 1984. His attacks accelerated through the spring and summer of 1985. He killed at least 13 people in California and attacked dozens more. His victims ranged in age from 9 to 83. He raped, he sodomized, he gouged out eyes. He left an AC/DC cap at one scene and wrote the words, "Jack the Knife," in lipstick on a mirror, in pentagram drawings left at crime scenes. He wore no gloves, an extraordinary risk, but arrived at scenes with such confidence and departed with such speed that forensic recovery was repeatedly compromised. The break in the case came through a partial fingerprint lifted from a stolen car. It matched Richard Ramirez, who had an existing criminal record. Police released his photograph to the media on August 30th, 1985. The following morning, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles by bus from a trip to Arizona, unaware his face was on every television in California. He was recognized at a convenience store in East Los Angeles. He ran. A group of neighborhood residents chased him through several backyards, catching and beating him before police arrived. He was nearly killed before officers could restrain the crowd. At trial, Ramirez showed no remorse. He carved a pentagram into his palm and displayed it for the jury. He shouted, "Hail Satan," in the courtroom. He was convicted of 13 counts of murder and sentenced to death in 1989. Ramirez died of B-cell lymphoma on June 7th, 2013, at San Quentin State Prison at the age of 53, before his execution date was ever scheduled. He had spent 23 years on death row, during which time he received fan mail from thousands of people and married a woman who had written to him in prison. In the summer of 1985, California installed more window locks than in any comparable period in the state's history. Richard Ramirez had done what no public safety campaign ever could. He had made an entire city afraid of the dark. He was charming. He was intelligent. He was handsome in a conventional, reassuring way. He had attended law school. He had worked on a political campaign and impressed the people around him. A woman who worked with him on a suicide hotline later wrote a book about him, describing him as kind and competent. The governor of Washington State, who met him through his political work, said years later that Ted Bundy had been one of the most outstanding young men he had ever known. Ted Bundy murdered at least 30 women. The real number is probably higher. He confessed to 30 and then hinted at more in the days before his execution. The confirmed victims span 5 states. The suspected victims may span more. Nobody knows with certainty how many people Ted Bundy killed. He began killing in 1974 in Washington State. Young women started disappearing from campuses, from parks, from neighborhoods, disappearing without trace, without witnesses, with no physical evidence connecting their cases to each other. Bundy's method was to approach women in public settings, sometimes with a fake cast on his arm or claiming to need help, and offer or request assistance in a context that seemed reasonable and safe. He was, by all accounts of survivors, unthreatening. He did not match the profile of a predator because no profile of a predator looked like Ted Bundy. He moved to Utah, then Colorado, then Florida, leaving dead and missing women behind him. He was arrested twice. He escaped from custody twice. The second escape from a Colorado jail in December 1977, when he had months to prepare, lost weight to fit through a ceiling crawl space, and walked out at night, led to a final killing spree in Tallahassee, Florida, before his third and final arrest in February 1978. In Florida, he attacked a sorority house at Florida State University in the early hours of January 15, 1978, killing 2 women and injuring 3 others in the space of 15 minutes. 3 weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. He was stopped for a traffic violation and arrested. The officer who stopped him had no idea who he was. He was identified through the license plate of the stolen vehicle. Bundy defended himself at trial, conducting his own cross-examination, inserting himself into the legal process with the practiced confidence of someone who had studied the system he was inside. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to death on death row. Bundy offered confessions in exchange for appeals and delays. He described killings in procedural detail to FBI agents and investigators, sometimes providing information that led to the recovery of victims who had been missing for years. He seemed to enjoy the process, the attention, the authority of being the only person who knew what had happened. He was, even then, performing. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at the Florida State Prison. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered to celebrate. People held signs. People cheered. The execution was broadcast on radio in Florida. It was one of the most publicly anticipated executions in American history. Bundy had spent his final days attempting to delay execution through extended confessions. He described victims who had not been previously connected to him. He pointed investigators toward remains that had not been found. Some families got answers in those final days. Some did not. The confessions stopped when the execution happened. The question that Bundy's case generates: and that researchers, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals have studied for decades, is how someone who was observed closely by intelligent, experienced people across multiple years could have concealed what he was. How the governor of Washington could call him outstanding. How the colleague who later wrote the book about him could have worked alongside him daily without the slightest awareness. The answer, as far as it has been established, is that predators who look like Ted Bundy do not come with warnings attached. Charm is not a personality trait that fails in the presence of evil. The qualities that make someone seem trustworthy are entirely compatible with the qualities that make someone dangerous. Ted Bundy knew that. He used it deliberately as a method, and it worked for years on everyone who met him. The investigation continues. Between 1971 and 1973, 3 young girls were murdered in Rochester, New York, and the surrounding area in Monroe County. Each victim had a first and last name that began with the same letter. Each body was found in a town whose name began with the same double letter as the victim's name. The pattern was precise enough that it seemed deliberate, as if the killer was communicating something through the selection of victims and disposal sites. The victims were Carmen Colon, age 10, found in Churchville in November 1971. Wanda Walkowicz, aged 11, found in Webster in April 1973. Michelle Mayenza, aged 11, found in Macedon in November 1973. 3 double initials, 3 matching towns, 3 girls from working-class families, each abducted from a public area, assaulted, and killed. No witnesses, no forensic evidence sufficient to bring a prosecution, no identified perpetrator. The case became known as the Alphabet Killings, or sometimes the double initial murders. It generated one of the most sustained investigations in the history of Monroe County law enforcement, running across decades with modern forensic reanalysis applied to preserved evidence. The most significant breakthrough came in 2007, when DNA extracted from evidence in the cases produced a male profile. The profile was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system. It did not match anyone in the database. Investigators have used genetic genealogy techniques to narrow the profile to a candidate, a man named Joseph Nasso, who was charged in connection with murders in California that exhibited similar patterns and who had a detailed record of photographing victims. He was convicted of 4 murders in California in 2013 and sentenced to death. Nasso was identified as a suspect in the Rochester cases and extensively investigated. He lived in the Rochester area during the period of the murders. His behavior and his later confirmed crimes were consistent with the profile. He denied any connection to the Alphabet Killings. The DNA from the Rochester cases was compared to his profile. The results of that comparison have not been publicly disclosed in a way that has produced a charge. Joseph Nasso died in custody in California in 2022 while his appeals were pending. The Rochester cases remain officially unsolved. The pattern that defined the case, the double initials, the matching towns, has been interpreted in different ways. Some investigators believe it was deliberate, a signature, a communication, a game the killer was playing with investigators. Others argue the pattern may be coincidence, that Rochester's geography and naming conventions produce enough options that the apparent pattern could be an artifact of victim selection and disposal location, rather than intentional design. If it was intentional, it raises the possibility the killer knew his victims' names before selecting them, that the selection process was specific and premeditated in ways that went beyond opportunism, that he chose Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Mayenza for reasons connected to who they were, not just where they happened to be. 3 girls, 10 and 11 years old, taken from their neighborhoods, from public spaces where children moved through the world with ordinary trust, killed by someone who has never been conclusively identified, and who, if the DNA from the cases belongs to the killer, remains in a database as an unmatched profile. The profile is still in the system. The database grows every year. Somewhere there may still be a match waiting to be made. In the spring of 1919, the people of New Orleans received a letter. It arrived at the offices of the local newspapers and was published across the city. It was written, it claimed, by a supernatural entity, a demon or devil, who announced that he would return to New Orleans on a specific night, March 19th, 1919, and that he would kill again. The only exception he would make, the letter stated, was for any household where jazz music was being played. At any address where jazz rang out from midnight until the early hours, he would pass by. On the night of March 19th, 1919, New Orleans played jazz until dawn. Every dance hall, every club, every parlor, every household hosted music. The streets were loud with it. And that night, nobody was killed. The letter may have been genuine. The letter may have been written by a copycat or a journalist. But the person or persons who had been killing New Orleans residents since 1918 were very real. And the letter demonstrated something that has never been explained. The Axeman of New Orleans communicated with the city that feared him, taunted its police department, and was never caught. The first confirmed attack occurred on May 22nd, 1918. Joseph and Catherine Maggio were found in their bedroom, their throats cut, their skulls crushed by an axe found nearby. The back door had been chiseled open. The couple's nephew was briefly suspected. He was released. No arrest was made. Over the following year and a half, a series of similar attacks occurred across the city. The victims were predominantly Italian-American families, many of them grocers. The pattern was consistent. Rear entry through a chiseled door panel, an axe used as the primary weapon, often abandoned at the scene. Some victims survived. Their descriptions of their attacker were vague and inconsistent. The police investigated. They pursued multiple suspects. Several people were arrested on circumstantial evidence and released. One man, Joseph Mumfre, was shot dead by the widow of one of the victims, a woman named Esther Pepitone, who was charged with murder and served a short sentence, claiming Mumfre had confessed to the killings in her presence. Mumfre had served prison sentences for burglary and had been released just before the first attack. His movements aligned roughly with the attacks, including periods where the attacks paused during his incarceration. Some historians consider him the most likely suspect. No physical evidence connected him definitively. The attack stopped after December 1919. Whether because Mumfre was dead, because the killer had died or moved, or for some other reason, has never been established. New Orleans in 1918 and 1919 was a city navigating its particular complexities. Italian immigrants faced significant discrimination and suspicion. The police department was not noted for sophisticated investigative capability. The city had recently emerged from one epidemic and would face another. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed New Orleanians in numbers that dwarfed the Axeman's victims. Against that backdrop, the investigation of a serial killer operating through chiseled back doors received the resources it received, which were not sufficient. What remains is the letter. Written in a florid Victorian style, claiming supernatural origins, offering a specific and bizarre exemption, jazz music, that was taken seriously by a city frightened enough to comply. Whether it was written by the killer seeking attention, by someone seeking to exploit the public panic, or by a person who had simply read too many Gothic novels, the letter succeeded in its apparent purpose. It terrified the city. It produced no useful evidence, and it became the most memorable artifact of a case that produced no justice. The jazz played that night. The city survived until morning. The Axeman never explained himself. He never had to. In the fall of 2002, the greater Washington, D.C. area became a killing ground. It lasted 23 days. It covered 5 states. And for 3 weeks, a metropolitan area of 5 million people was terrified to pump gas, to walk to their cars, to stand still in a parking lot. The snipers, it turned out, had been watching them all along. The first confirmed attack happened on the 2nd of October, 2002, in Wheaton, Maryland. A man named James Martin was shot and killed in a grocery store parking lot. The next morning, in a span of 2 hours, 5 more people were killed across 3 jurisdictions. A taxi driver, a landscaper, a program analyst, a homemaker, a construction worker, all shot with a single bullet, all killed in public spaces. There was no apparent pattern, no specific target type, no consistent location, no predictable timing. The shots came from nowhere. Witnesses reported nothing useful. The bullet caliber was eventually determined to be .308 Winchester, a common rifle round. A task force of local and federal agencies was assembled. Tips poured in. Leads were pursued and exhausted. The sniper left notes at the scenes. One read, "I am God." Another complained that the investigators were not taking the communication seriously. A later message gave a phone number and asked police to check a robbery in Montgomery, Alabama. When investigators called that number, they reached a dead end. But the Alabama lead was real. A murder there was later connected to the same rifle. Profilers insisted the shooter was likely a white male, probably acting alone, probably with military experience. They were wrong on all counts. There were 2 of them. John Allen Muhammad was 41 years old, a Gulf War veteran from Tacoma, Washington. Lee Boyd Malvo was 17, a Jamaican national who had entered the country illegally. Muhammad had befriended Malvo, essentially adopted him, and over months had radicalized and trained him. They had been traveling the country together in a blue Chevrolet Caprice they had modified, cutting a hole in the trunk so that a person could lie inside and fire through a concealed port without ever being visible from outside the car. Police had received a tip about the Caprice days before the arrests. The tip had not been acted on efficiently. On the night of October 24th, a civilian trucker heard a radio broadcast describing the car and called authorities. Muhammad and Malvo were found asleep in the vehicle at a rest stop on Interstate 70 in Maryland, less than 70 miles from the center of the killing zone. They were taken into custody without incident. Muhammad was tried, convicted, and executed in Virginia in November 2009. Malvo was sentenced to multiple life terms. In subsequent years, he gave interviews from prison describing the attacks and Muhammad's influence over him in disturbing detail. He has since expressed remorse in ways that investigators and victims' families have responded to differently. 10 people died. 3 others were wounded and survived. The youngest victim was a 13-year-old boy shot on his way into school. What the case left behind was a specific and particular fear, the fear of open space, of the ordinary moment made lethal, of the parking lot as a kill zone. For 3 weeks in 2002, the people of Washington, D.C. did not know how to stand outside. They crouched behind car doors. They ran in zigzag patterns. They pumped gas from a crouch. They changed their routines in ways that, for some of them, never fully went back to normal. And the blue Caprice, the car with the hole in the trunk, is on display at the National Museum of Crime and Punishment. You can walk up to it and look at the hole, and if you stand there long enough, you understand exactly how someone could disappear from view while loading a weapon that would kill you before you heard the sound. The morning of January 15th, 1947, started like any other in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. A woman was walking with her young daughter along South Norton Avenue when she noticed what she initially thought was a department store mannequin lying in a vacant lot. She walked closer. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. The body had been severed clean in 2 at the waist, drained completely of blood, washed meticulously, and posed face up, arms raised above the head at right angles, legs spread apart. The cuts were surgical, precise. Whoever had done this had taken their time, and they had done it somewhere else. There was not a single drop of blood at the scene. She was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short, and in death she became a legend, the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth had arrived in Los Angeles chasing the dream that brought millions to that city, a life in the movies or something like it. She waitressed. She modeled when she could. She moved from rooming house to rooming house, from man to man. Friends described her as beautiful, sweet, a little lost. She had a habit of disappearing for days at a time, then reappearing without explanation. In January 1947, she had been seen alive for the last time 5 days before her body was found. Those 5 days remain unaccounted for. The LAPD launched one of the largest investigations in the department's history. Over 150 men confessed to the murder. All of them were cleared. Thousands of suspects were interviewed. The case generated more tips than any other murder investigation in Los Angeles history. None of them led anywhere. The killer was never found. What detectives did learn painted a disturbing picture of Elizabeth's final hours. She had been held captive for at least 2 days before her death. The ligature marks on her wrists and ankles showed she had been restrained. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, followed by cuts to the face, what investigators described as a Glasgow smile, sliced from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. She had been tortured before she was killed. The surgical precision of the bisection led investigators to focus on men with medical or anatomical knowledge, doctors, surgeons, medical students. The body had been drained through the femoral artery, suggesting someone who knew exactly how to do it. But that knowledge alone pointed to hundreds of thousands of people in a city that size. A week after the body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner received an envelope. Inside were Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her Social Security card, an address book containing dozens of names, and a note assembled from cut-out newspaper letters that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The letter never came. The address book had been wiped with gasoline, destroying any fingerprints. The items had been handled by someone who knew what they were doing. The killer was playing with the police, and the police knew it. Suspects have accumulated over the decades. George Hodel, a physician and LAPD suspect at the time, was later accused by his own son, himself a retired LAPD detective, of being the killer. His son found photographs in his father's belongings that he believed were of Elizabeth Short. Hodel had the medical knowledge, the connections, and the personality. He fled to the Philippines weeks after the murder, but he was never charged. Others have pointed to Walter Bailey, a physician who lived a block from where the body was found. His daughter later said, "He confessed to the killing on his deathbed. He had knowledge. He had proximity. He is now dead." Some investigators believe the killer was part of the Los Angeles underworld that flourished in that era, a world of corruption, vice, and violence that the LAPD was deeply entangled with. A world where bodies could disappear, evidence could be buried, and a killer could walk free. What we know for certain is this: someone tortured a 22-year-old woman for days. Someone drained her body of blood, cut her in two with surgical expertise, cleaned every inch of her skin, drove her to a quiet residential street, and laid her out like an exhibit. Then they sent her belongings to a newspaper just to make sure the world was watching. And then they disappeared. 79 years later, nobody has been charged. Nobody has been convicted. The case remains open. Elizabeth Short's killer lived out the rest of their life, perhaps comfortably, perhaps surrounded by people who never knew, and died without facing any consequence for what they did in those 5 dark days in January 1947. There is a city in California built on dreams and on the wreckage of dreams, on glamour and on what glamour costs. The Black Dahlia became its darkest symbol, a beautiful woman who wanted more than the life she had, who found herself in the company of the wrong person at the wrong time, and whose death became the story while her life became a footnote. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Remember her name. On the morning of February 25th, 1957, a man checking rabbit traps in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia discovered a cardboard box near the side of Susquehanna Road. Inside the box was a small boy. He was approximately 4 to 6 years old, wrapped in a plaid flannel blanket. He had been beaten. He had been cleaned. His fingernails were cut. His hair had been recently washed. Someone had cared enough to clean him before abandoning him in a box by the side of a road in the dead of a Philadelphia winter. The boy wore no clothing. He had no identification. No one came forward to claim him. The box he was found in was traced to a nearby discount store, J.C. Penney, which had sold bassinet sets in similar packaging. That lead went nowhere. Flyers were distributed across the city. His photograph appeared in newspapers. A cast of his face was made, then distributed to police departments across the country. Not a single person recognized him. Investigators named him America's unknown child. More than 40,000 flyers went out across Philadelphia. School children were dismissed and told to ask their parents if they recognized the boy. Officers canvassed the Fox Chase area door to door. Nobody in that neighborhood, in that city, in that country could say who he was. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull consistent with multiple blows. There were surgical scars on his ankle and groin, suggesting prior medical care, which meant someone had once taken him to a doctor. His stomach contents indicated he had eaten recently before his death. He had a small L-shaped scar near one eyebrow. He had never seen a dentist. He was well-nourished, meaning he had not been starved. In 2002, a woman contacted investigators with an extraordinary account. She claimed that as a child, she had been placed in a foster home run by a couple in Philadelphia in the mid-1950s, a home she described as a house of abuse. She said she believed the boy may have been one of the foster children who had died and been discarded. Investigators took her seriously. They exhumed the boy's remains, extracted DNA, and compared it to every available relative, the foster parents, their known associates, any surviving connections. Nothing matched definitively. In 2019, a forensic genealogy team working with the FBI applied the same DNA technology used to catch the Golden State Killer. They identified a family line. They narrowed the boy's likely ancestry to a specific immigrant family from the Northeast. They identified a possible mother. But the DNA match was not perfect, and the family members they found denied any knowledge of the child. No prosecution followed. As of today, the boy has not been officially identified. He was reburied in 1998 in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. His gravestone funded by donations from law enforcement officers who had worked the case decades earlier. It reads, "America's unknown child. Someone once cut this little boy's nails and washed his hair. Someone once took him to a doctor. Someone knew his name. And whoever they were, they put him in a box and drove away. After 67 years, that person, or their secret, remains unclaimed. For 31 years, a killer lived among the people of Wichita, Kansas. He coached a Boy Scout troop. He served as a church president. He was a code compliance officer for the city, knocking on neighbors' doors to report them for overgrown lawns and unleashed dogs. He had a wife, children, a routine, a life that appeared entirely ordinary from the outside. Inside, he was writing letters to the police, taunting them, describing his murders in meticulous detail, asking them to give him a name. They gave him one: BTK, bind, torture, kill. And for 3 decades, they could not find him. Dennis Rader killed 10 people in and around Wichita, Kansas, between 1974 and 1991. He killed families. He killed women home alone. He killed a college student. He killed with methodical premeditation, stalking his victims for weeks or months before striking, cutting phone lines, disabling escape routes. He called himself a sexual sadist. He kept trophies. He photographed himself in the clothes of his victims, wearing restraints, staging scenes of domination. He needed the world to know what he had done, and the not knowing ate at him. His first murders occurred on January 15th, 1974. He entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita, cut the phone line, and waited. When Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and their 2 youngest children arrived home, Rader bound and killed all 4 of them. He strangled Joseph and Julie. He hanged their 11-year-old son Joey from a pipe in the bedroom. He took 9-year-old Josephine to the basement, tied her to a pipe, and strangled her there. Then he went home. He wrote letters to the local newspapers about the killings, letters that began with the phrase, "I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your agency." He described the murders in clinical detail. He signed them BTK. The letters caused panic in Wichita. Police had no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses, no useful physical evidence. The BTK killer was a ghost. Over the next 17 years, Rader killed 6 more people. He murdered a 19-year-old student. He killed a woman he had stalked for months, then photographed the scene. He killed neighbors. Each time, there was no physical evidence trail. He was meticulous. He was patient. And then, for reasons nobody fully understands, he stopped. The killings ceased in 1991. For over a decade, Wichita exhaled. Cold case investigators worked the files but made no progress. The community began to wonder if BTK had died, or moved, or simply chosen to stop. In 2004, a local journalist published a series of articles on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. Dennis Rader was in his 50s by then, a church president, a grandfather. He read the articles, and something in him that had been dormant for 13 years woke up. He began sending letters again, communications to the media, to the police, each more elaborate than the last. He sent photographs of his crimes. He sent items belonging to his victims. He asked in one letter whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police planted a false response in a newspaper advertisement, saying that floppy disks could not be traced. Rader used a floppy disk. It was from Christ Lutheran Church. Metadata on the disk pointed to a man named Dennis. Within days, police had identified Dennis Rader. A DNA sample from his daughter, obtained through a medical procedure, confirmed it. On February 25, 2005, 31 years after his first murders, police arrested Dennis Rader in his car on a suburban Wichita street. At his sentencing, the families of his victims faced him. Some spoke. Some could not. Rader sat and listened with the expression of a man at a slightly dull administrative meeting. He described his crimes in detail to the court, using the language of procedure, talking about his victims as projects, using the word "it." He expressed no remorse. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. He will die in prison. The city of Wichita spent 31 years afraid to be home alone, afraid of strangers at the door, afraid of a name written in 3 letters. And all that time, the man behind the name was walking among them, binding, torturing, and killing people in their homes. Then going back to his family, his church, his desk at City Hall. Dennis Rader is still alive today. He writes letters from prison. Nobody writes back. Between 1934 and 1938, a killer operated in Cleveland, Ohio, with a method so precise and so brutal that the city's safety director, a former FBI agent named Elliot Ness, the same Ness who had brought down Al Capone in Chicago, declared it the worst criminal case he had ever encountered. The killer dismembered victims with such anatomical expertise that investigators believed the perpetrator had surgical or medical training. The victims were decapitated. The bodies were found scattered across the city. Most were never identified. The case is known as the Cleveland Torso Murders, or the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. At least 12 victims, possibly more. 0 convictions. Zero confirmed identification of the killer. The first confirmed victim was found in September 1934, though investigators later attributed earlier discoveries to the same perpetrator. The remains were found in Kingsbury Run, a large ravine in Cleveland that served as a gathering place for the city's substantial transient population during the Depression era. The choice of location was significant. Kingsbury Run was populated by men who had no fixed address, no community connections, no one who would notice their absence quickly. The killer had chosen a hunting ground populated by the most invisible people in the city. The victims whose identities were established were men. Some may have been women. The condition of the remains in some cases made gender determination difficult. Several were determined through dental records or personal effects found at the scene. Most were never identified and remain known only as Case 1, Case 2, and so on through the investigation files. The dismemberment showed consistent technique. The decapitation was performed with skill and precision that excluded a random or frenzied attack. The chemical treatment applied to some remains suggested an attempt at preservation or accelerated decomposition. The person doing this knew what they were doing. Elliot Ness conducted one of the most intensive investigations of the era. He had police informants, medical experts, and what resources were available to the 1930s Urban Police Department. In 1938, frustrated by his inability to identify the killer, he ordered a controversial police sweep of Kingsbury Run, rounding up hundreds of homeless men, questioning them, and destroying the shantytown camps in the ravine. The sweep produced no useful leads and was widely criticized. One suspect attracted sustained attention. Dr. Francis Sweeney was a physician with surgical training, a family connection to a prominent Ohio congressman, and a history of erratic behavior that eventually resulted in his commitment to a veterans hospital. Ness interrogated Sweeney personally and at length. Sweeney reportedly failed a lie detector test regarding the murders. He was never charged. The congressional connection created political complications for any prosecution. He spent the rest of his life in and out of psychiatric institutions, occasionally sending taunting postcards to Ness, even after Ness had left public life. He died in 1964. Whether Sweeney was the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run has never been legally established. The evidence against him was circumstantial. The evidence for other suspects was also circumstantial. The case never progressed beyond suspicion. The torso murders revealed something about the limits of 1930s forensic capability and about the specific invisibility of the Depression-era poor. In a city with thousands of transient men, the killer had an effectively unlimited supply of victims who would not be missed, on territory where no witnesses would come forward. 12 confirmed victims whose remains were found in a ravine and a river, most of them unnamed even now, killed by someone who possessed significant anatomical knowledge and used it over 4 years without once leaving a trace that led investigators to a courtroom. Elliot Ness, who had been celebrated as America's most effective law enforcement officer, never solved this case. It followed him for the rest of his life. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was never found. On the morning of November 15, 1959, the Clutter family of Holcomb, Kansas, was found murdered in their home. Herb Clutter, a prosperous wheat farmer, was 48 years old. His wife Bonnie was 45. Their daughter Nancy was 16. Their son Kenyon was 15. All four had been bound, gagged, and shot at close range with a shotgun. The murders shook a small insular farming community in western Kansas that had seen almost no violent crime in its history. And they inspired a book that transformed the way America understood criminal investigation and the lives of killers. Herbert Clutter was, by every account, a man of integrity and community standing. He was a founder of the Finney County chapter of the Farm Bureau, active in his Methodist church, respected by neighbors and employees alike. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He paid his workers fairly and settled his accounts on time. He was, by every available measure, a man who had done nothing to attract violence. The killers drove over 400 miles to find him. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had met in the Kansas State Penitentiary. Hickok had received a tip from a fellow inmate, a former Clutter employee named Floyd Wells, that Herb Clutter kept a large safe in his home containing $10,000. The tip was false. There was no safe. Herb Clutter conducted all business by check and rarely kept cash in the house. Hickok and Smith drove to Holcomb on the night of November 14th. They entered the farmhouse, bound the family, and spent several hours inside the home searching for the safe. When they found nothing, they killed all four. First Herb in the basement, then Kenyon, then the mother and daughter in their separate rooms. The entire family was shot with a 12-gauge shotgun, and in Herb Clutter's case, his throat was also cut. Smith later said he felt nothing. 2 boot prints at the scene, one with a diamond-patterned sole, became the critical evidence. Investigators traced the pattern to boots sold at a particular store. Floyd Wells, hearing of the murders in prison, came forward with Hickok's name. Hickok and Smith were arrested in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959, after being tracked through a series of bad checks they had passed across multiple states. Truman Capote, who had read a small notice about the murders in the New York Times, traveled to Holcomb with Harper Lee in January 1960 to interview residents and investigators. He spent the next 6 years reporting the story, gaining extraordinary access to Hickok and Smith on death row. In Cold Blood was published in 1966 and is widely considered the first major work of literary nonfiction, a genre it effectively invented. Hickok and Smith were executed by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary on April 14, 1965. Perry Smith's last words were an apology to the Clutter family. He said he had never wanted it to go the way it did. He said this to the same investigators who had photographed the farmhouse in Holcomb that November morning. The quiet rooms, the bound bodies, the absence of the safe that was never there. On the afternoon of February 13, 2017, 2 teenage girls, 14-year-old Liberty German and 13-year-old Abigail Williams, went hiking on the Monon High Bridge Trail near the town of Delphi in Carroll County, Indiana. It was a school holiday. The trail, built along an old railway trestle above Deer Creek, was a popular local spot. Liberty's older sister dropped them off at the trailhead. They planned to be picked up later that afternoon. They were never seen alive again. Their bodies were found the following morning, February 14th, in a wooded area near Deer Creek, a short distance from the bridge. The Carroll County Sheriff released almost no details about the cause or manner of death, and those details remain officially sealed to this day as part of the ongoing case. What investigators did release, with remarkable and unusual deliberateness was something else, evidence the victims had captured themselves. Before she died, Liberty German had activated her phone camera. She recorded a man following them on the bridge. The footage showed a man in a blue jacket, walking with his hands in his pockets, stepping along the wooden boards of the trestle. The quality was imperfect, but the figure was identifiable. Shortly after, the phone captured audio, a man's voice, low and commanding, saying 2 words, "Down the hill." Indiana State Police released the photograph and the audio recording publicly. They asked the community for help. The image went around the world. Hundreds of thousands of tips were submitted. For 6 years, despite one of the most visible public evidence releases in murder investigation history, no arrest was made. Then, in October 2022, Indiana police arrested Richard Allen, a 50-year-old pharmacist from Delphi who had lived in the town for years. He had been interviewed by police shortly after the murders in 2017 and had been noted as someone who had been in the area that day. But he was not initially considered a suspect. In 2022, investigators re-examined evidence, and they said connected Allen to the scene through unspecified physical and forensic evidence. Allen was charged with 2 counts of murder. His trial began in October 2024 and was marked by extraordinary legal turbulence, a change of venue, multiple attorneys, sealed proceedings, and disputes over evidence that became the subject of intense public and legal scrutiny. He was convicted on both counts. He maintained his innocence throughout. The voice on Liberty German's phone, 2 quiet words recorded in the last moments before 2 children were killed on a bridge in Indiana, remains one of the most haunting pieces of audio evidence in American criminal history. Whether Richard Allen was the man who spoke those words is now a matter of legal record. Whether the full truth of what happened on the Monon High Bridge Trail on February 13, 2017, has been completely revealed is a question that Delphi's residents continue to ask. On the evening of February 9, 2004, a 21-year-old nursing student at the University of Massachusetts named Maura Murray drove her car into a snowbank on a rural road in northern New Hampshire and disappeared. The car was found minutes later by a passing school bus driver who saw her there. She told him she had called for help. He returned home to make the call himself, and when he and police returned to the site a short time later, Maura Murray was gone. She has not been seen since. What makes this case unusual, and what has sustained a dedicated community of investigators and amateur researchers for over 2 decades, is not just the disappearance itself, but the events that preceded it. In the days before she vanished, Maura Murray sent emails to her professors and to her employer explaining that she would be away due to a family emergency. There was no family emergency. She withdrew cash from an ATM, her last recorded financial transaction. She researched rental cabins in Vermont and New Hampshire online. She purchased wine and alcohol with cash. She left the University of Massachusetts campus and drove north into a region she had some prior connection to through family trips. When her car went into the snowbank and she told the bus driver she had called for help, she had not. No call was made from her phone. She had, it appeared, planned to go somewhere. What she was planning and where she intended to go is not known. The road where she crashed, Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, is sparsely populated. It was February, dark, cold. The snow on the ground would have preserved footprints, but by the time a comprehensive search began, the snow had been disturbed by the initial responders. A scent dog tracked a trail from the car to a position some distance away, and then lost the scent. The trail led toward a house occupied by a man whose conduct in the aftermath of the investigation has attracted significant attention from researchers. He has denied involvement and was never charged. In the years since 2004, the case has been investigated by the family, particularly Maura's father, Fred Murray, who spent years and considerable personal resources searching for his daughter, by law enforcement, by journalists, by podcast researchers, and by an online community that has developed detailed theories across every possible explanation. The theories range widely: that Maura staged her disappearance deliberately and is living elsewhere under a new identity, that she was struck by another vehicle after leaving her car and the driver fled the scene, that she was abducted by someone who happened to be on that road, that the sequence of events in the days before her disappearance reflects a personal crisis of some kind that has never been fully established, that she wandered into the winter landscape in a state of distress and did not survive it. Her body has not been found. No forensic evidence has led anywhere. No witness has come forward with information that has changed the investigation's direction. No one has been charged. Maura Murray was 21 years old. She was a nursing student with a complicated past year. A car accident for which she was at fault. Difficulties in her personal life. A family situation that her acquaintances describe in terms that suggest complexity without providing specifics. She was, by every available account, a person under pressure who made a series of decisions in the days before her disappearance that she did not explain to anyone who has come forward to share them. What those decisions were in service of, what she was trying to get to, or away from, or toward, is not known. Fred Murray died in 2023, having spent 19 years searching for his daughter without finding her. He never stopped. He published what he knew. He spoke publicly. He drove those roads in New Hampshire again and again, looking for something that would give him an answer. He died without one. Maura Murray remains a missing person in the state of New Hampshire. The file is open. He operated in California for over a decade. He broke into homes at night, bound his victims, and committed crimes of such sustained violence that investigators who spent their careers on the case described it as unlike anything they had seen. He was known by different names in different jurisdictions: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Diamond Knot Killer. It was not until 2013 that investigators connected all his crimes to a single person, and not until 2018, more than 40 years after his first known offense, that they identified who he was. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. He was 72 years old. He was a retired police officer, and he had been living quietly in a suburb of Sacramento for decades, within driving distance of many of the communities he had terrorized. D'Angelo's crimes began in 1973 and continued through 1986. During that period, he committed a minimum of 13 murders and 50 rapes across 12 California counties. These are the confirmed figures. Investigators believe the actual numbers are higher. He targeted suburban homes, often in communities where residents had little reason to feel unsafe. He conducted surveillance before attacking, sometimes for months, studying routines, mapping escape routes, sometimes calling victims in advance and whispering threats into the phone before hanging up. His methods were distinctive and consistent enough that investigators recognized a pattern across the attacks, but could not connect them to a single individual because the crimes crossed multiple police jurisdictions that did not routinely share information with each other. The East Area rapist in Sacramento was not known to be the same person as the original Night Stalker in Southern California for decades. The databases that could have connected the evidence did not exist or were not used. The forensic evidence collected at crime scenes over the years included biological material that contained the perpetrator's DNA. For decades, that DNA sat in evidence files, real, preserved, waiting, without a match in any criminal database. D'Angelo had been briefly investigated in connection with 2 burglaries in 1979 and fired from the Auburn Police Department, but had never been arrested for a serious crime and had never submitted DNA to any database. The breakthrough came through genealogy, investigative genetic genealogy. The use of publicly available consumer DNA databases to identify unknown suspects through their relatives was an emerging technique in 2017 when the team working the Golden State Killer case decided to try it. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy website. They found distant relatives, cousins and second cousins who had submitted their own DNA seeking information about their ancestry. Working backwards through family trees, constructing genealogical maps of the suspect's potential relatives, narrowing the possibilities through cross-referencing ages, locations, and other factors, the investigative team identified Joseph James D'Angelo as a primary suspect. To confirm, they needed a direct DNA comparison. Police collected a discarded item containing D'Angelo's DNA, something he had touched and left in a public place, and compared it to the evidence from the crime scenes. It matched across all tested markers. On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights. He was retired. He had a garden. He had grandchildren. Neighbors described him as private, but unremarkable. None of them had any reason to suspect what he had been. At his sentencing in 2020, D'Angelo spoke for the first time about the crimes. He said there was a monster inside him that he could not control. He said he was sorry. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. The survivors of his attacks, many of whom had lived for decades without justice and without explanation, were present in the courtroom. Some spoke, some could not. The case changed law enforcement forever. Investigative genetic genealogy, once a novel technique, is now used routinely across the United States in cold cases where DNA is available. It has identified perpetrators in dozens of murders that had gone unsolved for decades. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that DNA evidence, preserved long enough, could eventually yield a name even without a database match. It also demonstrated something more uncomfortable, that the person who did these things had been a police officer, had known exactly how investigations worked, had used that knowledge to evade detection for 40 years, had retired on a pension, lived in a neighborhood, attended family events, and been a grandfather. While his victims rebuilt their lives around what he had done to them for 45 years.